Thanks very much. Thanks, Ms. Donnelly, for coming to talk to us today and to answer so many questions that you're dealing with. The first one I want to go back to is the question of just transition and the role of the Advisory Council in relation to government policy. You talked about how things go from, you don't make the policy, but you review government policy to see if it's in line with the Climate Action Plan. And I know this was an issue that came before the plan was devised, but I would like to ask you, given that you say that all voices need to be heard and we have to listen to everyone, and that a just transition and how we move away from fossil fuel industries should be about no loss of income, retraining people properly, provision of jobs, how the experience in Bord-na-Móna ties in with the plan, the Climate Action Plan, and what the Climate Advisory Committee would like to see happen. Have you any intention of reviewing that whole experience? Because I do see it as the first real litmus test for the government in terms of just transition, and if you would make some comments on how that was dealt with. The second thing is about meat production, and I just, again, it's about government policy and how this fits in with the Climate Advisory Council's views. We know that the beef sector is effectively controlled by a handful of very, very profitable companies. We've heard so much about beef barons and that sector over the years, while at the same time there are so many small farmers that struggle to get by on the low farm gate prices that they get and the subsidies that favour the larger producers to build a model that the government have promoted to export beef and dairy to newer and newer markets. Do you see a change in government policy when it comes to how these things work in terms of a just transition for the smaller farmers, but also in a policy to reduce our emissions? And that just brings me on to the next question, which is, you talked about the need to be energy efficient while at the same time having a target of emissions reductions. And I'd still struggle, having listened to loads of questions and answers about the data centres and the commitment by the government to develop 2 more gigawatts of gas, which very recently, I think Senator Boylan mentioned it, that at a conference, an industry conference, EirGrid confirmed to the data centre industry that 2 gigawatts of gas-fired power is to allow them to develop and to prevent them from shutting down. And do you not think that this is contradictory in terms of the ambitions of the plan and the role of the Climate Advisory Council, that if we take this sort of policy, we are locking ourselves into another 20, 25 years of gas infrastructure, which flies in the face of the idea that we need to move away exactly from this? And my last question is on forestry. And I'm very glad to hear that you described the shocking fact that our forestry sector has become a net emitter of CO2 as a policy failure. And given the repeated failures to meet the afforestation targets, along with other climate-related issues such as biodiversity loss, would you think now is the time to have a review of the role of Coillte and to revisit the mandate that Coillte have under the current model, that it's a commercial model but doesn't favour or prioritise the environment or manage and maintain what is a valuable future for us in terms of climate emissions? I think that's
Thank you, Deputy Smith.
Questions.
Oh, okay, thank you very much indeed for that. On the just transition one, and specifically the case of Bord-na-Móna, we have a member of our council who was very closely involved in that. So we were certainly briefed on some of the things that did happen. The kind of lessons that the council has taken out of that as, shall we say, the first really big experience in Ireland is, firstly, honesty. The situation with Bord-na-Móna should not have come as a surprise to anybody. The timing was faster than some of the rhetoric had been, but honesty is the key issue. I mean, it has been known for many, many years that the possibility of continuing to produce electricity from peat was contradictory to our climate policies. That was known. And the extent to which honesty came into the play in terms of telling both the workers and indeed the management of the company about the reality of that and providing them with alternatives early enough is perhaps the single lesson that has to be taken out of that. We need to be honest. We cannot hide these things or shy away from them. And in being honest, we need to put the measures in place that will support people. And I think that, you know, the Bord na Móna case is an illustration of why we need to do it that way and how we can best do it that way and get it right. Because we will have similar, maybe not as large, but we will have similar situations coming up again where fossil fuel-based activities will be negatively impacted by this transition. And that's why we need to be honest with both workers, their families and their communities about what is the long-term trend so that they can prepare themselves and find alternative sources of income and activities and jobs. On meat production, one of the interesting things that we did have, and it's indeed in some of the slides linked to our technical report, is we looked at where the beef industry is located in Ireland. And you're right, you know, the dairy industry is very much to the south and west, and the beef industry is west, east, but in the top half of the country. Not exclusively, of course, but large numbers of it. And you're right to say that we have a lot of small farmers who are in beef, many of whom do not make any money from that activity. And this again comes from the Teagasc figures, the farm surveys that they do every year. And the challenge that we have, and this again we've gone to again and again, is that the issue we need to deal with in this context is income streams for farmers. That farmers need to be able to run their farms in a way that is profitable for them and for their families and ultimately for their communities, that's consistent with our climate action, and that allows them to be innovative in the environment that they find themselves. And for beef, for some of the small beef farmers who currently today don't make money from beef and are surviving on Pillar 1 payments coming out of CAP, then we should be looking at how do you support those farmers into income streams that are more beneficial for them. And that's part of some of the initiatives that Teagasc has mentioned in its listing of things going forward. I'm not going to make comments on the structure of the industry because it's something that the Council of itself hasn't actually discussed in any detail. When we look at the whole question of the double metrics of energy efficiency and emissions reductions, one of the challenges, and I know there's been a lot of discussion about data centres and a lot of the fingers have been pointed to data centres in terms of why we had the Amber Alerts. And we had the Amber Alerts this year because 2 gas-fired power stations were out of action. And that meant that we didn't have the backup that we would normally have had from those 2 fired power stations. And we are moving forward now to a very high level of renewable energy, which is a variable power source with stability and frequency challenges for the grid. And when I look at other countries that have an 80% target, and for example, Portugal has an 80% target for 2030, Austria has a similar target, Denmark has a similar target. But all of those are interconnected to large energy markets which provide balancing services to the grid. We don't have that. We have basically the East-West interconnector to the UK. We have potentially Greenlink coming on stream, and ultimately we'll have the Celtic interconnector. We have connections to the north of Ireland, and one which still isn't built. We don't have sufficient balancing support from outside of the island for the volume of renewable power that's planned in this process. So we need to develop our technology and our capacity to maintain stability in the grid over the period of the decade so that we can achieve it. The SPNP needs to move from 75% up to 90% and indeed even higher in order to make it possible to have that level of renewable power in our grid. And that's why the gas-fired power stations are being proposed. It's stability of the grid. Yes, we have a volume increase. We have a volume increase because our economy, fortunately, is doing very well. Our population is growing. And yes, we have data centres that will consume more energy. But it's not only data centres. We are predicting, for example, a 20% increase in population between now and 2040. And hopefully our economy will continue to do well, which is likely to also require electricity demand. And we're moving heating and transport into electricity. So electricity demand will go up over the period. But coping with the stability of the grid, with renewable energy, we are at the forefront globally in this respect. When we get it right, and I believe we will get it right, we will be the living lab for the rest of the world as to how to integrate renewable power into the electricity system. And so this is a short-term fix for that technology gap that we have that needs to be plugged right at this point in time. On forestry, the issue on forestry is one that it's actually private planting rates that have fallen off. And part of why I say the policy needs to be addressed is because the incentives for farmers and landowners to actually invest in forestry are obviously not working and need to be adjusted to make it attractive. It is a source of carbon farming for farmers, and they need to get the income stream out of it. They need to get the reward for that, but they need the incentives, they need the structures in place that will allow them to devote parts of their land to forestry development going over the period of time. And I see it's one of the issues that has been identified in the Climate Action Plan for 2021, but the new policy is only foreseen for 2023. And perhaps that's something that could be enhanced in terms of timing.
Thank you, Deputy Smith.
Thanks very much, Ms Donnelly. I'm quite surprised by a few of your answers, particularly the one on farming, because it implies that the small beef farmers are the problem and that we need to do something about them. I'm also surprised that we think this gas production is short-term. We're being locked into a fossil fuel future for at least 20 years by increasing our gas production. And just so you know, we have been told through PQs and by meeting the industry that private planters of forests cannot get the licences. There's such a backlog on them that they are not the problem. There's so much applications in there for private planting of forests that people are screaming at us to do something about it. So I don't think that that's the problem, but I am surprised at a few of your answers on those issues.
Thank you, Deputy Smith. Deputy Ms Donnelly, I'll give you a chance to reply there, because I think
I absolutely don't. I would be very upset if you thought that I was saying that small farmers were the problem, because indeed that was not the intention, and certainly not the message that I would like to portray on this. What I'm saying is that for small farmers who currently are not making money out of beef, we need to ensure they have an income stream. That's the message that we have, and that we need to look at what are the alternatives that are available to farmers in that context. On the forestry, when I say the policy isn't working, the policy is holistic. And if the policy doesn't allow licenses to be issued, then we need to revisit the policy. So the implication wasn't that private people weren't doing it. Where the issue is that if our administrative structures are not able to deliver the volume that we actually need, then we have to revisit our administrative structures, including how we issue licenses, in what form and how long it takes. So I perhaps wasn't sufficiently clear on that one. That's the message there. It isn't a criticism of Quilcha or private landowners. It's that our system is wrong, and therefore we need to revisit our system.
Thank you, Ms.
Donnelly. Thank you, Ms. Donnelly, and thank you.